So let's talk about another thing about this season. And of course, we were talking about a lot of these things along the way, but I want to, like, in the scope of things, talk about the fact that this season felt in some ways un-Game of Thrones-like. And there were a few reasons that was. One was the question of it simply being happier than usual. Again, I know it's all relative because we can name a ton of miserable things that happen and unhappy events and characters we like dying, but for a season of Game of Thrones, there was a lot of upbeat stuff happening this year. And then the other, of course, was the predictable nature of the story, which, again, this show has this big onus of the fact that it's based on books, that some of which have been out since the early 90s, people. So people have been theorizing about this for 23 years or so. And so now they were delivering on a lot of these. And again, it was a strange situation because they're delivering in the show before the books get to these things. And a lot of times it was the most common theory was the one. What did you think overall of that? Did it kind of throw you? Did it take you out of the show, that like these things that were uncharacteristic of it? Or did you just accept that's where we are now?
I know that I was more upset along the way. Looking back, things like The Hound, it was such a fun piece to find in George's writing that when the show just lay it out there, I thought that was a little bit of a letdown that he was alive. They're like, oh yeah, he fully is. And what they did with Brother Ray. I mean, it's hard for me not to compare it to the books because that is what they're based on. But you're right. I think a big shift is that it's just moved past the books and they're doing things their own way. And I will argue that a lot of the best parts of Game of Thrones, the show, come straight from George, all the way down to, I think, the Hodor death and Hold the Door reveal was one of the biggest and best payoffs, I think, this season, and one of the biggest surprises, and that Dan and David have confirmed comes straight from George. Right. I think that you're right. Some of the things they sort of cut corners on felt like it was dropping the ball and wasn't as interesting, and that they had to do it simply for time. But there also were some things that were just on the show that we didn't really have a lot telegraphed to us, like Cersei blowing up King's Landing. And by the way, because I got so much flack for it, George R. R. Martin pronounces Cersei, and years ago I started pronouncing it that way. I got so much flack for it, and even if you watch the show, the actors and everyone else, they say Cersei in their British accents, not Cersei. So, sorry, that was an aside. I had to get that out there. That being said, the wildfire in King's Landing I loved, and that was something that was so well established this season. It does feel different, though, for me, and I think this is, a little bit of a spoiler warning, but we had the Tower of Joy be a big moment. We got half of it in the finale, and this is the current thing I'm annoyed at, but this sort of sums up the season to me, is they went and confirmed the other half in an infographic on makinggameofthrones.com, and I was like, come on, like these are big moments that even if everyone assumes it, you want it to be dealt with some sort of like grace, and the reason why people care is because they were set up so well, and so to sort of drop the ball on the execution, especially when you're passing the books and spoiling some of these things for people who have been waiting for it, like you said, for decades, is a little bit of a letdown.
Yeah, so we should clarify that, like, since we recorded The Last Dragons, the fact that Rhaegar is Jon's father was just confirmed on an official infograph online, which is kind of a strange way to confirm.
Still, I'm
big
a little salty.
Yeah, but I will say it's one of those things where it's almost Game of Thrones, both the books and the series had raised the bar so high for shocks, right? I mean, obviously Ned dying being the first, like, oh my God, just didn't see that coming because that's not dramatically what we expect, right? And then a lot of them since. But that being said, there is something to be said for paying things off in a satisfying nature. So yes, Jon's parents were the most common theory.
Yeah.
And cold hands was the most common theory. We think that's the books. That's like one of those murky ones a little bit. But a lot of times you just have to think about, we joked with the Rhaegar with the reveal when they didn't say the name on the show. We're like, well, at this point, if it's not him, that would be kind of ridiculous, right? Because then you'd be sort of pulling something out randomly that would be really hard to reconcile. So I think it's one of those things where even when the books, if the books had come out before these seasons, we still have to accept that these people have guessed it because, again, they had decades, and then they had the internet where people could share their theories, which only makes it harder to, to come up with something that no one's going to guess.
And it's a story that's so layered, right?
Yeah.
That part of the fun, I think, even for people watching on the show, is to try and figure things out before they happen. And the second you have a big question mark, like, oh, who's Jon Snow's mother? You want to figure it out.
Yeah.
And the show did a great job layering in hints throughout the seasons, just like the books did. It's when, the show doesn't have time to pay off some of those things that it gets disappointed, or you're right, when, we've spent so much time thinking about them and you think that they're worth more weight than they are, and they don't always get that.
Right. But I guess my main thing there is that predictable doesn't, in and of itself, isn't bad if it makes sense story-wise. I guess that is why I share in your frustration about the Rhaegar reveal not being revealed off the show, though, is like, just do it, people. Like, give us all the info.
I just wonder if there was like a disconnect, or but I feel like that was intended to come out that way because they promoted it on Facebook.
Yeah.
They're like, here's Jon Snow, how Jon Snow connects to Daenerys or whatever. And then they also advertised it like that in the blog. They're like, oh, and here's your proof that like Rhaegar is Jon's father. And you'd think, you intentionally only give the half of it. You think that they're saving it so it could get this big explanation or something on the show for the other half. So that was a little bit of a disappointment. And when we were talking about it with the Hound in particular, about whether so many people predicted this and it was a little bit of a letdown when it happened, I didn't think the Tower of Joy was a letdown. I think it's all in the execution, which we're sort of saying over and over again. But I want to go back to that because we got a lot of flack for that because we've also predicted a lot, and it's you think you have some portion of the big picture, but you want the execution to further that and to explain to you why is this so important.
Right.
And I think with the Hound still, why is he back? It's really cool that he is back. It's really cool that he's teamed up with the Brotherhood without banners. But you want to have a little bit more of that understanding of that, even if you don't know what his bigger purpose is, that he has a bigger purpose.
Right.
So I think that was sort of the fine line there for me.
I will say on the subject of sort of the happier things or more triumphant things for good people happening this season, in a way, that was Game of Thrones being subversive to themselves, because, and that is the thing. That's like, going back again to one of the big moments of the season, which was Sansa and Jon, their big reunion. I fully expected, because Jon was getting ready to leave, like, oh,
that they were
another near miss,
each other,
you know? So it was at that point, because that had kind of become Game of Thrones' thing, right? Like these near misses. So then they see each other, and I actually think it makes it even more impactful, because that's not what Game of Thrones does. And then I will say, because there are a couple storylines, that I feel really dragged. And, we've talked about Braavos, the fact that it was 2 full seasons of Arya and Braavos, that the, sum total of is she can kill better. Don't know if they needed 2 on-screen seasons of that. And even King's Landing, which ended so strong, but for a lot of the season was like another year of the Sparrows in control.
People moving chess pieces around and not
a lot of
actually
people
doing
in
anything.
cells and leaving cells. So that being said, that's why I was so thrilled when Dany's story, which kind of began very frustrating, right? Like, oh, she's back with the Dothraki. She's back in sort of a bad place, after having some moments of triumph. That's why it was so exciting when I think it was the 4th episode where she turned the tables on them, because I had expected the rest of this, or a lot of the season might be her back with them. And so instead, no, she totally, kicked ass and got a big, cool naked fire scene.
All Amelia, too.
All Amelia, as
her.
she's proud to say.
Yeah.
There was no body double. I just think that this season, it almost became the Game of Thrones after so many years of the subversive thing being we're going to always have a terrible thing happen. This year it became, we're going to have a triumphant thing happen.
And I feel like part of that is the showrunners and writers just finally listening to criticism.
Yeah.
I think that they were a little bit resistant.
Especially
to
after 5.
Yeah, I think. But 5, if you look back on 5, and one of the first spoiler-free teases I was given for this season was good things actually do happen.
Yep.
And I think it's because if you look at 5, part of the reason I think why people didn't respond well to it is nothing good happened to any character. It was terrible thing after terrible thing, rape, murder, death, like just so many bad things happening over and over again that it's hard to find any, not even joy, but enjoyment from there. And in Game of Thrones, you're right, is a show that prides itself on not giving you the outcome you want, but you still have to have something to root for.
Yeah.
And they really did bring that back a lot. And you're right, once you get close to the end, at a certain point, good things have to start happening or just everyone's going to be dead.
Right. And again, it's one of those things where it's, of course, we're not delusional about the show is a dark show.
Right.
And bad things are going to happen and will happen till the very end, I'm sure. But yeah, season 5, I think, was a tipping point for people because not only had it happened for 5 years, but also that season did sort of traffic more than ever in just bad things happening. And at a certain point, it's not even interesting dramatically, right? It stops, you start to become dull to it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, this season took a flip to the other side. It felt jarring at times because it's like, this isn't my Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Like, all these happy things are happening to people I like. But I ultimately think it was kind of a cool way to go with it.
Yes, I agree.